Dr. Terrence Baker coming to you from the studios of NABN TV with a special report. The war between Russia and Ukraine continues to worsen each day. Consequences of this war are being felt worldwide, particularly in the area of food supplies. The war between Russia and Ukraine will be devastating for the people worldwide struggling with food shortages. Before the Ukrainian-Russian war, global hunger rose secondary to COVID-19. COVID-19 pandemic disrupted food supplies around the world, and those nations that were already living in poverty with food shortages, the supply lines were broken and the amount of hunger increased. The United Nations State of Food Security Council reports that 9.9% of the world's population currently is malnourished and hungry. 811 million people were malnourished in 2020 as a result of disrupted food supply from the pandemic. This had risen from 8.4% in 2019 to 9.9% in 2020, and over 15% of the world is expected to be hungry by Christmas 2022. The war is having a fantastic, devastating effect on food distribution. Of those individuals that are hungry, over one half live in Asia. 1/3 live in Africa. In 2020, 21% of African people were starving, 2 times the amount of starvation and hunger that was being experienced by any other continent. The African nations have a profound inability to feed themselves and rely on the world to purchase their grain and even their fresh water. Russia is a leading exporter of wheat. Ukraine is a 4th exporter of wheat in the world. Together, Russia and Ukraine supply the world with 1/3 of all the exports of wheat. Most Russian and Ukrainian wheat goes to the Middle East and to the African nations. Egypt is a #1 top importer of wheat. 1/4 of the population of Egypt is currently living below poverty levels. Russia and Ukraine supply 85% of Egypt's imports of wheat. Russia and Ukraine is the largest exporter of fertilizers in the world. Fertilizers are required in order to supply the earth of the nations of the world with the nutrients required to grow crops in other countries. For example, India is a large importer of fertilizer. 1/3 of all potash comes from Russia and Ukraine. India depends and relies heavily on Ukraine and Russia to manufacture components and fertilizers necessary for India to grow the crops and to support themselves. India exports to the world about 5% of the food that it goes to other nations in the world. 95% of the food raised by India stays in India. There are no reserves, no significant reserves of grain existing at this time. And the reason being is that the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has required use of reserves of wheat and grains by the nation of the world to feed their peoples during the broken supply lines of the pandemic. Also, rising cost of the grain will disable many nations and will force many individuals to go without the necessary nutrition required to maintain their health and the health of their family. Skyrocketing oil costs, for example, will drive up the production of grain, but will also drive up the distribution cost of the grain. Cost of wheat has in the last several weeks surged to $13 a bushel. In 2021, before the invasion, there was a shortage of food that affected 5.3 billion people. The food security of the world is moving towards a world emergency. There's a direct relationship also between hunger and terrorism. That is, that people, when they cannot purchase the food, cannot grow the food that they need to sustain themselves, often it's an opportunity for terrorists and extremism to infiltrate. There also is an additional problem. Over 1 billion of the world are legally invisible. That is, they were born into this world without any registration or birth certificate. This billion that has never been registered will cause an additional burden that isn't even known. That is, you literally have a billion members of humanity that are not accounted for when we're thinking about poverty, when we're thinking about hunger, when we're thinking about the resources necessary to feed ourselves. 625 million children under 14 have been born and never received a birth certificate and essentially are unknown, invisible to the world. These factors, the war, the pandemic, the oil surge, the recession that's occurring in many nations, appears to be heading to a shortage of food and water, the likes of which the world has never seen. It is important that all the nations of the world understand that war has consequences. And this particular war between Ukraine and Russia, some would call the breadbasket of the world, will have profound effects on every single nation in the world as we go forward. It is time for all of us to pay attention to what's happening here, because the effects as we go into the summer and into the winter of 2022 will more likely than not be experienced by all of us and will have significant impacts on our families in every nation, including America, Canada, Europe. All the nations of the world will feel the effects of food distribution shortage, fresh water shortages, which will occur in virtually every single nation. This is Dr. Terrence Baker, your host at NABN TV, Doctors in the House.